I will never forget the sound of her scream. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like something breaking inside. It came from next door where Mr. Adi and his daughter, Ada, lived. I was sitting in my room, scrolling through my phone, when it happened. The scream froze me in place. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then I heard muffled shouting, Mr. Adi's voice, deep and angry. My heart started pounding. I lived in a small neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and I had never heard anything like this before. I wanted to ignore it. My mom always said, don't poke your nose into other people's business. But something about that scream wouldn't let me sit still. I got up and looked out the window. The lights were on in Mr. Adi's living room, but the curtains were drawn. I couldn't see anything, only shadows moving behind the curtains. Then, it went silent. No more shouting, no more screaming. Just quiet, heavy and strange. I sat back down, my hands shaking. Should I call someone? Should I go next door? But what if it was nothing? What if I was just being nosy? I told myself to stay put. I tried to go back to scrolling my phone, but the scream echoed in my mind, over and over again. Something felt wrong. Something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was. Not yet. Over the next few days, something felt off. Ada didn't come outside anymore. She used to sweep the front porch every morning. Sometimes, she would sit by the steps, scribbling in her notebook. But now, it was like she'd vanished. I walked by their house every day after school. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn. The house looked empty, but I knew it wasn't. I saw Mr. Adi once, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. He smiled and waved at me like nothing was wrong. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. That evening, I stood at my gate, pretending to fix my slippers, watching their house. The light in their living room was on, but I didn't see Ada. Her bike, which usually leaned against the wall outside, was gone too. I told my mom about it while she was cooking. Mom, Ada hasn't come outside in days. She's probably inside helping her father, Mom said, stirring the soup. But why? She never stays inside this much. Don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong, she said. Families have their own issues. Leave it alone. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Ada wasn't just staying inside. It felt like she was trapped. It was past midnight when I saw the car. I had been lying in bed trying to sleep when the sound of tires crunching on gravel made me sit up. I peeked through my window and saw the car stop right in front of Mr. Adi's house. A woman got out. She wasn't his wife, I was sure of it. His wife was older, always dressed neatly in suits or traditional clothes. This woman looked younger, with tight jeans, high heels, and a top that barely covered her. She glanced around quickly, like she didn't want anyone to see her, then walked straight to the door. The door opened almost immediately, like Mr. Adi had been waiting for her. She went inside, and the door shut. I couldn't stop watching, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't understand. The lights in the living room stayed on, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. An hour passed before the door opened again. The woman walked out, adjusting her clothes as she headed back to the car. She didn't look around this time. She just got in and drove away. The next morning, I saw Ada for the first time in weeks. She was standing by the side of their house, hanging clothes on the line. She looked different, thinner, quieter. Her face was pale, her shoulders slumped like she was carrying something heavy. I wanted to ask her if she was okay, but something stopped me. Her eyes looked dead, like someone who had been crying for days and had no tears left. She didn't even look up when I walked past. Something was wrong. I could feel it, but I didn't know what to do. Things started to feel even stranger in the neighborhood. Whenever I walked past groups of women chatting, I'd catch bits and pieces of their conversations. His wife is never home, one said, shaking her head. Always traveling for work. What kind of mother leaves her child like that? Another added, I heard she hasn't been back in months. They say he doesn't even mention her anymore. The more they talked, the more I noticed things I hadn't thought about before. Mr. Adi's wife really was never around. I couldn't remember the last time I saw her at home. It was always just him and Ada. I heard my mom talking about it too. She had a friend over, and they were sitting in the living room. Something isn't right in that house, my mom said. Ada doesn't smile anymore. And she's always avoiding people. Her friend nodded. It's not normal for a child to act like that. And what about that scream you mentioned? You should keep an eye on them. Hearing them talk gave me chills. I couldn't stop thinking about the scream, the late-night visitor, and the way Ada looked so drained. It was like pieces of a puzzle were coming together, but I didn't want to see the full picture. Not yet. Something about it all felt too dark. Too real. It was a hot afternoon, and I saw Ada sitting alone by the gutter near her house. She had a small notebook in her lap, and she was writing so fast it was like she was trying to get all her thoughts out before they disappeared. I stood at a distance, unsure if I should approach her. I didn't want to scare her off, so I just watched. Her face looked tired, more than tired. It was like she had given up. Her eyes were red and swollen, her lips trembling as she wrote. Then, suddenly, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood up, and went inside. She left the notebook on the ground, forgotten. I don't know what made me walk over to it. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I already knew something was wrong and needed to see for myself. Whatever the reason, I picked it up. The notebook was plain, with no name on the cover. I hesitated for a moment. Should I open it? It felt like I was invading her privacy, but something in my gut told me I needed to look. The first page was filled with small, messy handwriting. I read the first line. I hate him. I hate him so much. My heart started beating faster. I turned the page and kept reading. The words became darker and scarier the more I read. He says I'm the only one who understands him now. He says I remind him of Mom when she was young. He touches me when no one is around. I feel dirty. I want to die. The notebook slipped from my hands and hit the ground. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak, like they were about to give out. My mind was racing. I looked around to see if anyone had noticed me, but the street was empty. The house was quiet. My chest tightened. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. Something terrible was happening in that house. I picked up the notebook and ran home. I had to tell someone. I couldn't keep this to myself. I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about what I had read in Ada's journal. My chest felt tight, and I knew I had to tell someone. The next morning, I showed the notebook to my mom. At first, she just stared at it, her face blank. Then she looked at me. This is serious, she said quietly. We can't ignore this. Let's go. We walked to Mr. Adi's house together. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. When we got to his door, my mom knocked hard, like she was ready for a fight. Mr. Adi opened the door, smiling like nothing was wrong. Mama Nkechi, he said warmly, pretending to be his usual self. What brings you here? But my mom wasn't playing. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. Where is your daughter? His smile slipped for a second, but then he laughed. What do you mean? Ada is fine. She's inside, resting. My mom pushed past him into the living room. Ada, she called. Ada sat in the corner of the living room, her small body curled up like she was trying to disappear. She didn't look up when we walked in. Her hands gripped the edge of her dress tightly, her knuckles white. Tell me what's going on, my mom said, her voice softer now as she knelt down in front of Ada. But Ada's body was trembling. She shook her head, tears running down her cheeks. I can't, she whispered. You can, my mom said gently. We are here to help you. Tell me. Mr. Adi laughed nervously behind us. Oh, Mama Nkechi, why are you making this kind of trouble? Ada is fine. Look at her sitting there. She's fine. But my mom wasn't smiling. Child, tell me what's happening. Don't be afraid. I'm here now. Ada started to cry harder, her words spilling out between sobs. He makes me stay in his room, she said. He touches me. My mom gasped, and I felt my knees go weak. Mr. Adi tried to step forward, but my mom turned on him, her face blazing with anger. How dare you, she shouted. How could you do this to your own child? Mr. Adi tried to speak, his voice shaking now. It's not what you think. Enough, my mom yelled, cutting him off. You're a monster. She grabbed Ada by the arm and pulled her to her feet. You're coming with us, she said firmly. Mr. Adi stepped forward again, but my mom didn't back down. If you touch her or me, I'll call the police right now, she said, holding up the journal. And I'll show them this. Ada looked at her father, terrified, but my mom held her tightly. Don't look at him. You're safe now. For a moment, he just stood there, his face pale and his hands shaking. Then he backed away, muttering under his breath. We didn't wait. My mom held Ada close as we walked out of the house, leaving Mr. Adi standing in the doorway, watching us go. Mr. Adi shouted as we left, his voice echoing through the neighborhood. If you take her, I'll call the police on you. I'll say you're kidnapping her. Do it, my mom snapped, her voice sharp like a knife. And when they come, I'll show them her journal. I'll tell them everything. His threat stopped. He stood there, fists clenched, breathing heavily, but he didn't follow us out. We walked quickly, almost running, back to our house. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what just happened. Ada didn't say a word the whole way, but she clung to my mom like her life depended on it. When we got inside, my mom locked the door and pulled Ada into a hug. You're safe now, she whispered. Ada didn't respond. She just cried, her tears soaking into my mom's shirt. For the first time, I realized how small she looked, like a child trying to hide in her own skin. That night, Ada slept in my room. She didn't talk, didn't eat, just curled up on the mattress like she wanted to disappear. I stayed up, watching her breathe, wondering how someone could hurt their own child like that. The news spread fast, and by the next week, Ada's mother, Mrs. Adi, came back. She arrived in the evening, dragging her suitcase behind her. She looked tired but furious, like someone ready for war. Everyone in the neighborhood came out to watch. She didn't waste time. She stormed straight into the house. From where I stood with my mom, we could hear her shouting. Adi, come out here. Now. Mr. Adi came out, acting calm, like nothing had happened. You're back, he said, smiling weakly. Mrs. Adi didn't smile. She held up Ada's journal, her hand shaking. How could you? How could you do this to your own daughter? He tried to talk, but she didn't let him. I left to make life better for us, and this is what you do. You ruined her. You're a monster. Ada stood behind her mother, tears running down her face. She looked so small, so broken. The neighbors were quiet, but you could feel the anger in the air. Some of the older women started shouting at Mr. Adi. You're a disgrace. How could you touch your own child? He didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at the ground. Then Mrs. Adi said, You will pay for this. I'm taking Ada, and you'll never see her again. And don't think I'll let you get away with this. The police will hear about everything. She grabbed Ada's hand and walked out. The neighbors clapped and cheered as they left, but I couldn't help noticing the sadness in Ada's eyes. It wasn't over for her, not even close. Ada's mother didn't waste time. She took Ada and the journal straight to the police station. She explained everything, her voice shaking with anger and pain. The officers listened carefully and asked Ada a few questions. She was scared at first, but with her mom by her side, she told them what her father had been doing. The police didn't hesitate. That same evening, they came to the neighborhood to arrest Mr. Adi. I watched from my window as they dragged him out of his house. He didn't fight back, but he kept shouting, It's a lie. They're lying. The neighbors all came out to watch. Some of them yelled at him, calling him a monster. Others just stood there, stunned. As the police car drove away, I looked over at Ada. She was standing with her mom, holding her hand tightly. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying, but there was a small flicker of relief. Maybe, just maybe, she felt safe for the first time in a long while. The next few days, people in the neighborhood couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Some were angry that nobody had noticed sooner. Others blamed Mr. Aid's wife for being away so much. But my mom told them all, this isn't about blaming anyone but him. He's the one who did this. Mr. Aid's trial came quickly. When Ada's journal and her testimony were presented in court, the judge didn't hold back. He sentenced Mr. Ade to 20 years in prison. The news spread like wildfire, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt a sense of justice. But justice didn't erase the pain. It didn't fix everything. It was just the first step in helping Ada and her mother rebuild their lives. And even though Mr. Ade was gone, the memories he left behind were harder to lock away. Months passed, but things didn't feel normal. Mr. Ade was in prison, but the house next door was empty and quiet. Ada and her mom moved to her grandmother's place in another town. It was like they wanted to disappear and leave all the bad memories behind. When Ada left, she was like a shadow of herself. She didn't smile anymore. Her eyes looked hollow, like someone who had cried too much. She stopped talking to people, even me. Every time I tried to check on her, she'd just nod or say, I'm fine, but I knew she wasn't. Some kids at school started whispering about her. They said cruel things, like she's weird now or it's her fault for not speaking up sooner. I wanted to punch them. They didn't understand. They didn't hear the scream. They didn't read the journal. Ada wasn't the same person anymore. It was like a piece of her had been stolen, and no one knew how to get it back. Even her mom looked like she carried the weight of what happened. She didn't talk about work anymore or dress up like she used to. Whenever I saw her, she was in simple clothes, holding Ada close like she was afraid to let her go. One time, before they left, I saw Ada standing outside the house, staring at the ground. I went up to her and said, You don't have to say anything, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. She didn't look at me. She just nodded and whispered, Thanks. Then she walked back inside. That was the last time I saw her. But even now, I still think about her. About how unfair it all was. About how someone so innocent could be so broken. And I wonder if she ever found a way to feel whole again. I don't know why I was the one to hear that scream, or why I felt the need to get involved. But I'm glad I did. If I hadn't, who knows how long Ada would have suffered. Sometimes, we don't want to get involved in other people's lives, but sometimes, we have to. Because if we don't, who will?